In April 1945, Berlin was a city under siege, its streets shattered by artillery and its people gripped by fear. The once mighty capital of Nazi Germany had become the last battleground of a collapsing empire, its fate watched by a world desperate for the war to end. The fall of Hitler's Germany is often seen as inevitable, a simple matter of military defeat. Yet the reality inside Berlin was far more complex, marked by chaos, desperation, and the unraveling of power at every level as the Third Reich faced its final reckoning. As Soviet forces closed in from the east and Western allies pressed from the west, Germany's territory shrank with alarming speed. Berlin, once the heart of Nazi ambition, was now isolated, a fortress surrounded and cut off from the outside world. Inside the city, the contrast between the regime's propaganda and the grim reality could not have been starker. While Nazi broadcasts promised miraculous salvation, Berliners endured shortages, constant bombardment, and the creeping certainty that the end was near. The final days of Hitler's Germany reveal not just a military collapse, but the breakdown of ideology, leadership, and human will. In these last moments, the regime's weaknesses, long hidden by violence and fear, were laid bare for all to see. By the spring of 1945, the strategic situation for Germany was hopeless. The Red Army, commanded by Marshals Zhukov and Konev, surged toward Berlin from the east, while American and British forces advanced from the west, leaving the city encircled. German defenses, already stretched to the breaking point, were forced to rely on hastily assembled units. Old men and young boys were conscripted to fill the ranks, a desperate measure that underscored the depth of the crisis facing the regime. Adolf Hitler, once the architect of lightning victories, had become increasingly disconnected from reality. From his underground bunker, he issued impossible orders and clung to fantasies of counterattacks by armies that no longer existed. Morale among both civilians and soldiers plummeted as defeat loomed. While some remained fanatically loyal, many more simply tried to survive, seeking shelter in cellars or fleeing the city as the front lines drew closer with each passing day. Nazi leaders responded to the crisis with a mixture of denial and brutality. Any sign of defeatism was punished harshly, as the regime tried to enforce obedience even as its authority evaporated in the face of overwhelming force. On April 16, 1945, the Soviets launched their final assault on Berlin. Massive artillery barrages lit up the night sky, and waves of Soviet troops began the brutal process of fighting their way into the city street by street. The battle for Berlin was one of the most intense urban combats in history. Every block became a fortress, with Soviet soldiers advancing through rubble and flames, while German defenders mounted desperate, often suicidal, resistance. Civilians bore the brunt of the siege. Food and water grew scarce, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to ruins. Amid the chaos, families were separated, and countless lives were lost in the crossfire between retreating Germans and advancing Soviets. Despite the devastation, Nazi propaganda continued to promise victory. Radio addresses and leaflets spoke of miracle weapons and heroic last stands, even as the city's defenders dwindled and hope faded with every hour. Inside the Führer bunker, beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's inner circle gathered in an atmosphere of paranoia and despair. Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and Heinrich Himmler vied for influence as the regime's collapse accelerated. Tensions ran high as trust between Nazi leaders evaporated. Betrayals and secret negotiations with the Allies undermined any sense of unity, while Hitler's rage grew at news of defections and failures on the front. Hitler's decisions became increasingly erratic. He refused to leave Berlin, insisting on a final stand in the city's ruins, and placed his faith in divisions that had already been destroyed and weapons that existed only in propaganda. The bunker became a place of desperate measures. Suspected traitors, such as Hermann Fegelein, were executed on Hitler's orders, as the dictator lashed out at those he blamed for Germany's impending defeat. With the city surrounded, Hitler issued his final orders. Boys from the Hitler Youth and elderly men from the Volkssturm were sent to the front lines, tasked with holding off Soviet tanks in a hopeless defense of the capital. As April drew to a close, the situation inside Berlin deteriorated rapidly. Soviet troops fought their way to the very center of the city, and the once Grand Reich Chancellery was transformed into a fortress under constant bombardment. Communications with the outside world broke down. Supplies of food, water, and ammunition dwindled, leaving those in the bunker and across Berlin to face starvation and surrender as the only remaining options. On April 28, Hitler received news of more betrayals. Heinrich Himmler had attempted to negotiate surrender with the Western Allies. This final act of disloyalty shattered whatever illusions remained within the bunker. In his last desperate hours, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun in a brief ceremony attended by his closest followers. The marriage was less a celebration than a final ritual before the end. Hitler then dictated his political testament, blaming others for Germany's defeat and urging future generations to continue the struggle. Even in his final words, he refused to accept responsibility for the catastrophe he had unleashed. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in the Führer bunker. Their deaths marked the symbolic end of the Nazi regime, though the violence and chaos in Berlin continued for days. Other members of Hitler's inner circle followed suit. Joseph Goebbels and his wife murdered their 6 children before taking their own lives, an act that underscored the fanaticism and despair that gripped the regime's last loyalists. With Hitler dead and the Nazi leadership shattered, a power vacuum emerged. Goebbels briefly assumed the role of chancellor, but his reign lasted less than a day before he too chose suicide over surrender. On May 2, 1945, the defenders of Berlin finally laid down their arms. Soviet troops accepted the city's surrender, bringing an end to one of the bloodiest urban battles in history and signaling the final collapse of Nazi Germany. For the soldiers who survived, surrender meant a perilous future. Many were taken prisoner by the Soviets, facing uncertain fates in captivity, while others tried to disappear into the ruins or join the masses of refugees fleeing the city. The civilian population paid a heavy price. As Soviet forces occupied Berlin, reports of violence, looting, and reprisals spread, compounding the suffering of those who had already endured years of war and deprivation. The physical destruction of Berlin was immense. Iconic landmarks lay in ruins, entire districts were reduced to rubble, and the city's infrastructure was left shattered by weeks of relentless fighting and bombardment. Amid the devastation, the myth of Nazi invincibility was finally destroyed. The collapse of the regime exposed the hollowness of its ideology and the catastrophic consequences of its pursuit of absolute power. The end of the Third Reich was not just a military defeat. It was the total discrediting of a system built on violence, lies, and racial hatred. The world saw firsthand the price paid for fanaticism and unchecked authority. In the aftermath, Germany was carved into occupation zones by the victorious Allies. Berlin itself was divided, setting the stage for decades of tension and rivalry that would define the Cold War era. For millions of Germans, the end of the war meant displacement and uncertainty. Families were uprooted, borders were redrawn, and the scars of conflict would shape lives for generations to come. The fall of Berlin signaled not only the end of one regime, but the beginning of a new world order. The division of Germany became a symbol of the larger ideological struggle between East and West. The lessons of Hitler's downfall resonated far beyond the ruins of Berlin. The dangers of absolute power, blind obedience, and the cult of personality became warnings for future generations navigating the fragile peace. Post-war Europe was rebuilt on the ashes of the Third Reich. Efforts to establish stable democracies, protect human rights, and confront the legacy of the Holocaust were shaped by the memory of what had just ended. Historians continue to debate how much of the collapse was inevitable and how much was the result of choices made in those final days. What remains clear is that the seeds of destruction were sown long before the final battle began. The Nazi regime, built on terror and deception, was never as strong as it appeared. Its collapse revealed the fragility of systems that rely on fear rather than legitimacy, and the limits of power wielded without conscience. The story of Berlin's fall is not merely one of armies and leaders, but of ordinary people caught in the machinery of history. Their suffering, endurance, and choices remind us of the human cost behind every headline and statistic. The ruins of Berlin stand as a testament to the consequences of hubris and denial. The refusal of Nazi leaders to face reality accelerated the destruction, turning defeat into catastrophe for millions. In the end, the collapse of Hitler's Germany was a process of unraveling, military, moral, and institutional. The regime fell not just because it lost the war, but because it lost its grip on truth, loyalty, and the basic bonds of society. The last days in the Führerbunker were marked by delusion and despair. The leaders who once commanded armies now hid underground, powerless to alter the fate they had brought upon themselves and their country. The fall of Berlin was not a single moment, but a series of choices and failures that compounded over time. Each decision rooted in denial, fanaticism, or misplaced hope pushed the regime closer to destruction. As the smoke cleared, the world was left to reckon with the meaning of what had happened. The collapse of the Third Reich forced a confrontation with the darkest impulses of modern history and the dangers of unchecked ideology. Today, the memory of Berlin's final days serves as a warning. The seductive power of certainty and the refusal to accept reality can drive even the most formidable regimes to ruin, leaving devastation in their wake. The simple explanation that Hitler's Germany fell because it was defeated on the battlefield misses the deeper truth. The collapse was also a failure of leadership, moral vision, and the ability to confront uncomfortable realities. Understanding the end of the Third Reich requires looking beyond the ruins and the headlines. It demands attention to the ways in which power can corrode and how denial in the face of disaster can accelerate catastrophe. The aftermath reshaped the world, dividing Europe and setting the stage for new conflicts and alliances. The lessons of those final days became essential reference points for leaders and societies striving to avoid the same mistakes. In the end, the ruins of Berlin are more than a symbol of defeat. They are a reminder of what happens when ambition is unchecked by conscience and when truth is sacrificed for the sake of power. The final days of Hitler's Germany revealed the limits of violence and the fragility of systems built on fear. The collapse was not only military, but a profound moral and institutional failure. Berlin's fall was not simply the end of a war, but a profound turning point in human history. The lessons of those last days remain urgent, etched into the memory of a world that must continually choose between denial and responsibility. The destruction of the Third Reich reminds us that no regime, no matter how powerful, is immune to the consequences of its own choices. The seeds of collapse are planted long before the final crisis arrives. The fall of Berlin was not only an end, but a warning, etched into the ruins of a lost empire. It stands as a testament to the dangers of unchecked power and the enduring human cost of ambition without restraint.